People coming up in the nicest possible way and just saying we want to tell our stories, because for the last few years they haven't been able to speak, have they? They have been, condemned, they have been punished if they do speak out. So now that they can, they want people to hear what they say. So let's have a taste of what people have been saying here in Manchester.
I cannot imagine we will arrive to this moment. Do you know what happened now? The dictator is gone. Sorry, this is the freedom for Syria. We pay a huge price for that.
We paid a lot during these 14 years. We hope that everything should stop now and we should start a new future for Syria, democratic Syria. Syria for everyone.
I was welcomed very well from the Mancunian people. Really, I am very, very happy to stay here. But I'm looking for the first flight to Syria to go back.
So absolutely delighted. They are hopeful. That is the word that keeps coming up. We don't know what the future holds, do we? But what they're happy with is that this dictatorship, as they've described it, this regime, is now over after half a century, that they will be able to now go home and see their loved ones and not face persecution for speaking out. And loads of people, young, old, all ages, want to go back, they say, and rebuild a new Syria. That is what they want, a new Syria. Lots of children here who were born probably here in Manchester will get to go and see relatives, grandparents, uncles and aunties back in Syria. But certainly the party is not over yet. Been going on since about 12 o'clock, and even the rain is not stopping them.
Charlotte, live from Manchester. Thanks very much indeed. Well, elsewhere, the government's welcomed reports that the Assad regime has fallen in Syria. Speaking on Sky News earlier, the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, warned that the situation is still precarious.
If Assad has fallen and that regime is over, I welcome that. He wasn't exactly good to the Syrian people. So we want to see a political resolution so that we can get that stability for Syrians and make sure that they have the infrastructure so that they have a political government there that is working in the interests of the Syrian people. That's what we need long-term for the area, and that hopefully working with our allies in the UN will be able to make sure that that happens.
Well, we've also heard from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who's in Bahrain. Dame Priti Patel told Sky's Trevor Phillips it's too soon to know what's going to happen next, but the focus should be on protecting the Syrian people.
The last few days, there's been much discussion about what has been going on in Syria and obviously some of the key players. But the reality is overnight, things have moved very, very quickly. And of course, that means that we all need to be watching the current situation very carefully. I think there is a degree of similar thought here that it's too early to know how this is going to pan out. But ultimately, Trevor, this is about the Syrian people. Syrians need to be protected, all communities and groups, including all minorities. So we all need to look very carefully about how we respond. And certainly from the perspective of this region, as ever, it's a case of how we work together to, I think, effectively try and influence the right kind of outcome, put the Syrian people first, but also look at the sort of governance structures that could occupy Syria going forward and what that means for us, not just abroad in this region, but actually for us domestically at home.
Okay, straight to our political correspondent, Liz Bates. Liz, a lot of political reaction, of course, and both sides, whether it's government or opposition, watching closely what happens in Syria. And this also, of course, impacts the UK, as we've seen over the years with migration and a lot of Syrians becoming British citizens, rebuilding their lives here.
Oh, certainly. There are implications for the entire world and here domestically in the UK. So very unsurprising that lots of UK politicians and politicians all over the world have been commenting on the unfolding situation in Syria. I think it was interesting to hear this morning from the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner and Priti Patel, former Foreign Secretary. I think both of them expressing caution, really, about the situation as it unfolds. welcoming, as you might expect them to, the fall of the Assad regime, but both concerned, I think, about what is coming in the future. You heard from Angela Rayner. What she said is that she and the UK government would like to see a political resolution in line with UN resolutions. Ed Davey went a little bit further, the Liberal Democrat leader. In his language, he called Assad a vile dictator, also talking about what was going to come next, and said that he would like to see an orderly transition and free and fair elections. Well, I'm sure that many would like to see that happen in the region. We're very far from that as it stands, but I'm sure diplomatic efforts will go on as far as they can to try to ensure that does happen in the weeks and months ahead. We haven't heard yet from the Prime Minister or indeed the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. Coincidentally, we expect the Prime Minister to be visiting the region, UAE and Saudi. That trip was primarily for discussing trade, but of course now global security and what has just happened in Syria will absolutely, I think, be top of the agenda, and how the region can progress and try to pursue those ends that we've just talked about, free and fair elections and so on. I think, as you said, there are implications as well, of course, domestically, and we've just seen that outlined perfectly in the scenes that we saw in Manchester. What happens in other places in the world when there is disruption of this kind is that it does impact all over Europe and in the UK. We've seen lots of Syrian refugees in the UK over the past few years. Many of them will return, but of course any disruption to a region like that could increase migration in other ways into the country. Those will all be things that are being discussed in government, and we do expect to hear from the Prime Minister in the next few hours.
Well, let's keep you up to date on this breaking news and bring you these pictures that have come to us from the presidential palace in Damascus. You can see there people are now inside having a wander around. Civilians on the red carpet. As they just take a look around, you could see people, men and women, walking around. That man seems to have taken a bowl away, people taking chairs away. Remember, the situation inside Syria remains desperate for many. There's a lot of poverty, food poverty. There you see people taking photographs of themselves with the peace sign. That man celebrating. Clearly, civilians are now coming out feeling safe enough to do so, going in to celebrate. For many, this is a celebration. And as we heard, even in Manchester, a festival atmosphere. And we saw yesterday as the rebels marched through various cities, Homs, Hama, and then eventually into Damascus, people coming out onto the streets, waving the pre-Assad regime flag, celebrating the arrival of the rebels. At least for now, this is a celebration and a moment as the Assad dynasty, his father in power for 29 years, he himself 24 years, finally comes to an end. You're watching Sky News. Stay tuned. Coming up, I'll be speaking to a former British diplomat on what could be next for Syrians and whether the British government will get involved following the collapse of the Assad regime. Welcome back. A reminder of our breaking news today. Rebel forces in Syria say they've captured the capital and ousted President Bashar al-Assad. Gunfire and chants of freedom are heard in Damascus as residents take to the streets in celebration. Rebels have stormed and ransacked the presidential palace, and people have taken to the streets of the Syrian capital to celebrate. Russian officials confirmed that President Bashar al-Assad has fled the country, but his whereabouts are not yet confirmed. Well, let's discuss all of these developments with Charlie Gamble, a former British diplomat and a Middle East consultant. Good to speak with you today, Charlie. I think it's fair to say that the war in Syria never really went away, but no one quite expected the Assad regime to finally be toppled quite so quickly.
Yeah, I think what we've seen here is the unthawing of a frozen conflict. And in the years since the sort of freezing of the conflict in 2020, when Russia and Turkey mediated a ceasefire over Idlib, the rebels have been getting stronger, funded by Turkey. And I think the Syrian regime has been getting weaker. Russia's become more distracted. Iran has been drawn into the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon. And Iranian support for the Syrian regime has crumbled. Hezbollah's ability to prop up the Assad regime has crumbled. And in the meantime, the Assad state reinvented itself as a narco state and a seller and producer of this synthetic amphetamine that's causing chaos across the region. So the point from which it froze, the point to which now a lot changed. And I think in that period, HTS and al-Jawlani have been revitalizing themselves, training, rearming, and preparing for this for a long time. So despite the fact that the international attention waned, the rebels have been preparing this for a long time and sought to pounce on the weakening of Assad's supporters.
Yeah, and as you say, they've been preparing for a long time. The regime has been in place for a very long time. This is the end of more than half a century of the al-Assad dynasty, a significant and historic moment for Syria. The question really is what happens in this power vacuum? You've mentioned the rebel groups. Of course, there are civilians who will want to get involved with politics now who have been waiting to as well. What fills this vacuum now?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, that the Syrian regime now is a bit of an anachronism, the Assad regime, given that it came about in a time of Cold War when you had secular Arab states that were socialist in outlook. And it feels strange that we still have one of those in this very religious Middle East, which is dominated by sectarian tensions, not by Cold War power plays. So the vacuum is huge. I think the vacuum... don't forget that the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, was Alawite, which is a minority Shia grouping in Syria. So they'd never represented the majority of people in Syria. But you're absolutely right. There will be an administrative vacuum. And I think the challenge that HTS have is very similar to the challenge that the Taliban had. How do you go from being a rebel group that's hoping to topple the incumbent government to being a functioning government? And they will have to wrestle with issues of consensus. They will have to wrestle with issues of peace. They'll have to wrestle with the narco state that the Assad regime has left behind. And there's some very powerful people who are running the sale of those drugs out of Syria and into the Middle East. So although this is a moment for rejoicing, and I think this is probably the first big revolution of the Arab Spring, because if you look at the other changes of government, they perhaps weren't revolutions. So HTS have a huge amount to do, and I think now it calls for consensus, and I think it calls for cool heads on the international stage as well, as Russia, Turkey, Iran, United States, everyone lines up to have a say in the future of Syria.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that, but briefly, before we get to the global reaction, particularly the UK, just want to pick up on what you said about it being a narco state and developing this drugs industry. Clearly, when you mention something like that, it's not just about the money. There's a lot of criminal involvement as well. There's all sorts of angles to being a narco state that could also impact what happens in Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, and those drugs went up sort of into Turkey and then beyond. So those supply lines, people will be incentivized to keep those supply lines going. People will be incentivized to keep the business going, and the pivot to producing and exporting these drugs was in part driven by European and American sanctions on the Assad regime, and they needed to foot the bill. So how that infrastructure is dealt with, and that was a big bone of contention between Arab states and the Assad regime. So how that is dealt with, I think, will define where this sort of next phase of Syria's future goes.
Interesting, and yeah, of course, we could go on and on talking about Iran, Russia, and the rest of the Middle East nations. I'm particularly interested to speak to you, Charlie, about the UK's involvement. You know, we've seen Syrians in the UK coming out on the streets to celebrate a significant amount of people. You know, we saw in 2014 migrating out of Syria towards Europe. How do you think the British government should respond to this, and what kind of involvement should they have?
Well, I think as with a lot of these things, the British government will be thinking, what issues affect us and are likely to affect us? And traditionally in Syria, it's been predominantly refugees, and it's been Islamism. And there was a time when the UK were supposed to have been supporting, or were perhaps supporting, the rebels that were trying to fight Assad, and there was an effort to try and topple the regime. The UK has also been cooperating with Syrian forces, Kurdish forces in the north to fight ISIS. So the UK's big lookout will be countering radical Sunni extremism, and then seeing what role it can play in the region as a mediator, as I suppose backing up what America's going to do. But what America is going to do is quite interesting, because Donald Trump in 2019 withdrew American support from Kurdish forces, the SDF in the north, that were integral in fighting ISIS. So I think that presents a real challenge. Do we throw our lot in with the SDF again and have them as a hedge, or I suppose as a counterpoint to HTS? Or do we throw our weight behind HTS, or do we try and play a mediator role? And I think the role of Turkey will be key in how we play, because our relationship with Turkey will be really important in how this plays out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, we're in between, aren't we, presidents, really? President Biden waiting to bow out, and Donald Trump already pretty vocal yesterday when he was in Paris about Syria. I want to ask you, while we have you, Charlie, we've talked a lot with analysts about Russia and Iran. I want to talk to you about Israel as well. Of course, we know that there is concern around the border area with Syria. What do you make of what might happen next vis-a-vis Israel?
I think Israel is cautiously optimistic. I think you have to remember that in Israel's sights is always Iran. And Homs was a crucial point from which Iran would get weapons to Hezbollah. So as Israel sees it, this is a potential weakening of Hezbollah, which is good for its war in Lebanon, but it's also a potential weakening of Iran. My concern as an analyst and a former diplomat would be that Israel, who has constantly and for a long time wanted to effectively get rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The concern is that now that Israel sees Iran as weak, which Iran is weak, and this is the biggest setback for the Islamic Republic, I would say, in 20 years. Iran is weak, but if Israel sees this as a point to try and deliver the final blow, I think that could be a big mistake. If anything, this conflict in Syria has shown us that unless these conflicts end, they have a habit of enduring. We only need to look at Afghanistan, and now we look at Syria. So any optimism that Israel has at the moment should be tempered by the fact that there is always the possibility that Syria could erupt into the sort of Sunni Islamism that we've seen over the last 10 years, and that would directly impact Israel's role in Gaza, perhaps, and it could also upset the region more broadly, particularly with Iran. How does Iran position itself? Does it feel threatened enough to go on the offensive? So Israel is cautiously optimistic. It's worried about chemical weapons falling into the hands of Sunni rebels, but I think it's seeing this as an opportunity and seeking to work with it. But all eyes should be on Iran, I think, at the moment, and potentially what's going on in Iraq as well, because don't forget, the Israelis have been bombing Iranian Shia militias in Iraq, who are integral to the security of that government there. So very fast-moving picture and very complex.
Very complex indeed, and really good to have your analysis. Charlie Gamble, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
You're watching Sky News. Stay with us as we bring you up to date minute by minute on this unfolding situation in Syria.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the net?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart.
China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank. These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them.
The referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again.
This is the third or fourth time in the 18 months that their homes have gone under.
Sky News, the full story first.
It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering designed to humour and to help us.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime. They don't care for that. Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Welcome back. Well, people across the UK are celebrating the downfall of Bashar al-Assad's regime. People taking to the streets earlier. We showed you scenes from Manchester. Well, let's take you to central London to our correspondent, Sadia Chowdhury. She's in Trafalgar Square this afternoon. Sadia, describe the scene there and tell us what people are telling you about how they feel about what's happening inside Syria.
Well, it's very similar scenes to Manchester here, a big crowd gathering and actually many more people slowly joining as the news spreads on social media that people here are celebrating. And, you know, virtually everyone I've spoken to today knows someone who has been, or themselves, who have been tortured by Bashar al-Assad's regime, who have had family members who have been imprisoned for many years or killed by the regime. So many people here, and by the way, there are people here of the Syrian diaspora who have lived here for many years, but also those who have arrived more recently, displaced, and not just once displaced, but multiple times, you know, who had lived in different parts of Syria and then ended up leaving Syria, finding their way to the UK. So there are people here who haven't seen family members in Syria for a great number of years, some who left just shortly after the Arab Spring uprisings started, who have never been home since then, who have children who are now teenagers who haven't seen family members in Syria for a long time. And they're talking about how jubilant this news is and how it came as a surprise to them. Many people saying that they couldn't believe it over the last few days when they saw signs that something may be happening, that they just couldn't believe that it would actually get to this. So overnight, a lot of people that I was speaking to saying that they spent all night up watching the news, watching the developments, and that they just couldn't believe it this morning when they realised that Assad has been ousted. And they've been singing songs today, glorifying Syria, talking about how Assad has left and that Syria is now free. But also many people that I've spoken to here today wanting the next steps, how to rebuild Syria and how to bring those who were responsible or complicit in all of those crimes to account.
And Sadia, Is there some apprehension as well there about what might come next? You mentioned there that there is a kind of celebratory feeling right now, of course, just like Manchester, almost a festival atmosphere. But as this sinks in, there will also be eyes turning to what next, not just for, as you mentioned, trying to get some justice in the international courts, but also what happens next in Syria and their potential return.
Yeah, this is, a really difficult moment for a lot of people who had fled Syria because of the war, who have come here. They've now had children here. They've got children growing up and going to school here. So when you ask people, do you hope to return? It's not a straightforward, yes, I want to go back. I have a home there. Homes have been destroyed. The country, they talk about the economy. They talk about the healthcare infrastructure there. There isn't really a home to go back to in that sense. So many people quite conflicted about that. But certainly they have their eyes on their family at home. Some people have been FaceTiming with family members, jubilant at the prospect of being, at least for the interim, reunited with family members before they can think about what will happen next. And there is an acknowledgement that this isn't going to be something that will fix overnight. They don't expect that now that Assad has gone, a democracy will be installed and they'll move over and be able to get home again. So very much a little bit of apprehension there, but a very jubilant crowd here looking towards the next steps.
Saadia Chowdhury live in Trafalgar Square as Syrians and well-wishers gather to mark the end of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Thanks very much indeed. Well, on the ground in Syria, this rebel offensive has seen a significant moment for Syria in its history. Earlier, my colleague Sam Naz spoke to Danny Mackey. He's a journalist in Damascus, and they discussed the current situation in the city.
It's been quite a spectacular evening in Damascus today. We've seen a number of really just stunning events which we haven't seen in years in the Syria conflict. I mean, we've seen President Assad flee along with his entourage and the ruling elite in the country. We've seen Damascus, the capital city, fall to the rebels completely almost for the first time in 15 years. There's still fighting ongoing within the city. I can still hear gunfire, the occasional explosion. But apart from that, I can safely tell you that by the morning, the whole of the capital will be under the control of the rebels, and this will probably herald a new dawn for Syrians. This is something that people have been pushing towards, and it's culminated in this offensive in Damascus, which was really actually supported by people within Damascus themselves, taking to the streets and picking up arms and taking this to another level. I mean, there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of people who are starving, people who are fed up with the long years of war, with the lack of development in the country, and definitely change was on the agenda. And with the loss of Syrian army morale, we've seen army positions be abandoned. We've seen soldiers literally just take off their military attire and wear civilian clothes, escaping anywhere to safety. We've just seen chaos today, and something which was completely unexpected. No one ever envisaged that things would happen in this particular way. The sheer chaos of it all is really something to take in this evening, and we're looking for a new Syria now, something that we can, as one population, a lot of the people from different sides have to come together and see where this goes ahead. We know that remnants of the old regime are still here, and they'll probably be willing to play a part in taking this country forward. But when the fighting stops, which should be very soon, you'll find the city united here.
We have a breaking news update to bring you on the condition of Mikel Antonio. He is the West Ham striker, of course, who was involved in that major car crash yesterday. The club have released a statement saying West Ham United can confirm Mikel
Wow, what a day. What a day in Syria. What a day. What a day. I just wanted to just quickly post that so that you just know what is going on. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to be updating as we go. Thank you so much for joining. Please, if you have not subscribed to my channel, do subscribe, like, share, click notification button so when we're on, you will be notified. Thank you so much. This has been long coming. It was just delayed. It was just delayed because Syria in the last few years has been helped by Russia and other countries like Iran, Hezbollah. So it has just kind of put them in a place where, you know, it hasn't been, they couldn't take over. But we just hope that this new one will be such a relief and a blessing to the people, so that they're able to thrive, you know, in what they're doing in their country. So it's such it's surprising. I wasn't even expecting it. You know, you just heard about the news that, oh, they're advancing. You think, okay, the Assad government is going to oppose them, and the next thing you hear, he's run away. A lot of people have died in this, but he's run away. Hopeful, you know, maybe with his family and all those people that are close to him, they all run away. I think his dad, that family has been ruling Syria for the last minimum of 50 years. So, it's come to an end. We pray that whoever is going to be the next leader, will have the people in their heart. Thank you once again for watching. I'll be updating later. Thanks. Have a good day. Bye-bye.